Hi, and welcome to this virtual tour of South Bend City Cemetery. My name is Travis Childs. I'm the Director of Education and your St. Joseph County historian. We hope you have a good time, so sit back and enjoy. South Bend City Cemetery is 21 acres in a trapezoid-type shape. The current shape and borders of the cemetery are due to 3 different expansions and a reconfiguration of the cemetery in 1899. The gate was built in 1899 and placed here to signify a new entrance that had been moved from Linden Street. It was commissioned by the city of South Bend and built by Champion Iron Fence Company of Ohio. The gate includes 2 dates. One date is 1832, when the cemetery was actually dedicated, and the other date, 1899, was when it was moved to the Elm Street entrance from Linden Avenue. The Sexton Cottage was built in 1899 to store records and serve the sexton of the cemetery, or cemetery director. It was built at a cost of $605 and only has 400 square feet of space. The interior contains built-in cabinets and bookshelves that once stored the records of the cemetery. The records are now stored off-site. Horatio Chapin came to South Bend in 1831. There were only about 10 log cabins and 168 people living here at the time Mr. Chapin came to South Bend. Chapin was the first merchant with a store on the banks of the St. Joseph River. He was also a real estate investor, religious leader, and the first librarian in town. He also founded the first Presbyterian church. Chapin bought land just north of downtown and built a large Gothic home in 1855. He surrounded his home with apple and grape orchards. Mr. Chapin called his new homestead Chapin Park. This is now a historic district on the northwest side of South Bend. And in this slide, you can see that the house, believe it or not, is still there. This is an original picture of the house when Mr. Chapin owned it. The house is still there at 413 West Navarre Street. Schuyler Colfax was born in New York City on March 23, 1823. His parents were Schuyler Colfax Sr. and Hannah Stryker Colfax. Mr. Colfax's father contracted tuberculosis shortly after marrying Hannah and died several months before the future vice president was even born. In 1836, Schuyler Colfax's mother married George Matthews, and the family moved to New Carlisle, Indiana. Without ever attending high school or college, Schuyler contributed articles to the New York Tribune, and he became friends with its editor, Horace Greeley. Schuyler began his political career as a rising star in the Whig Party, and at 19 years old became the editor of the 2 pro-wing South Bend, Indiana newspapers, the South Bend Free Press, which he purchased and renamed the St. Joseph Valley Register. Schuyler Colfax was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1852 and joined the newly formed Republican Party, which nominated Abraham Lincoln president in 1860. In 1862, Schuyler was elected Speaker of the House of Representatives, which, during his term, he announced the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which abolished slavery. In 1868, he was elected Vice President on the Ulysses S. Grant ticket. He was inaugurated on March 4, 1869, and served as Vice President until March 4, 1873. Schuyler led an unsuccessful campaign for re-election in 1872, leaving office under a cloud of suspicion that stemmed from his possible involvement in the Credit Mobilier of America scandal. After his term in office, Schuyler Colfax became a lecturer on his relationship with President Abraham Lincoln. It was widely held lore that Mr. Colfax was the last person in Lincoln's cabinet to talk with him before he left Ford's Theater on the night of his assassination. October 10, 1844, Schuyler Colfax married Evelyn Clark, who died childless in 1863. On November 18, 1868, Colfax married Ella M. Wade, with whom he had one son, Schuyler Colfax, also a junior, who would later become mayor of South Bend. On January 13th, 1885, Schuyler was presenting a lecture in Mankato, Minnesota, and after the lecture was over, he walked 3/4 of a mile in minus 30-degree weather to the Mankato train depot. While standing on the train platform at the station, he suffered a fatal heart attack brought on by the extreme cold and exhaustion. It took a few days before someone checked his belongings to find out his identity. His body was brought back to South Bend, and he was buried here in South Bend City Cemetery in 1885. To date, Schuyler Colfax is one of only 2 men in the history of the United States to have served as both House Speaker and Vice President. When President Grant and Vice President Colfax were inaugurated, they were the youngest presidential team to be elected until the inauguration of Bill Clinton and Al Gore in 19. When President Lincoln called for the first round of volunteers for the Civil War, John Oughton of South Bend enlisted. John enlisted April 22, 1861, in Company L of the 9th Indiana Infantry. On a scouting mission he volunteered for, he was killed at Belington, Virginia on July 10, 1861. He was the first resident of St. Joseph County killed in the Civil War. Oughton's body was sent back here to South Bend, where, on Friday, August 2, 1861, his funeral was held in the 1855 courthouse. The funeral was attended by 5,000 people. Oughton's coffin was enveloped with the American flag and ornamented with evergreen branches. Also on top of his coffin were 2 Confederate revolvers he had taken off a dead rebel officer. His body was escorted by fellow soldiers, and he was given a 21-gun salute while the coffin was being lowered into the grave. John Oughton was only 21 years old at the time of his death. Born in Scipio, New York, December 10, 1810, Colonel Norman Eddy, in 1836, moved to Mishawaka to study and practice medicine. 9 years later, he moved to South Bend after being accepted to the Indiana Bar Association. In 1852, he was elected to Congress after serving as an Indiana state senator. When the Civil War started, Mr. Eddy organized the 48th Indiana Regiment, with himself being raised to the rank of colonel. He was severely wounded at the Battle of Iuka in Mississippi. After he saw Vicksburg surrender, he retired from military service because of his wounds. He came back to South Bend and resumed his law practice and his role in Indiana politics, serving as Indiana Secretary of State from 1871 until his death in 1872. William George was born in Pennsylvania around 1833. He came with his family to the South Bend area when he was a small child. What he is known for around South Bend area is that he was the very first mayor of South Bend. Shortly after the city of South Bend was officially incorporated in May of 1865, a special election was held June 5, 1865, and Mayor George won after 542 votes were cast. He served until 1868. He built his home at 212 West Colfax, which still stands, even though it's been remodeled and reused by the Travel Moore Company. This is the final resting place for John and Rebecca Studebaker. John Studebaker was a Gettysburg, Pennsylvania resident who opened a blacksmith shop in his barn. During this time, he also became a very skilled wagon maker. John and Rebecca were the parents of 13 children, including the 5 brothers of wagon and automobile fame. Around 1835, John built a covered wagon and moved the family to Ashland, Ohio, then in 1851 moved to South Bend. John died in 1877 after having been married to Rebecca for 57 years. Peter Studebaker was the 4th Studebaker brother. He had been a merchant in Goshen and sold his store to join his other brothers in their wagon business here in South Bend. Peter was put in charge of sales and went throughout the U.S. setting up branch houses, or like dealerships. The first branch house was set up in St. Joseph, Missouri, where the Studebaker brothers could sell their famous wagons to those pioneers heading westward. After attending a family reunion in Ashland, Ohio, he fell ill and died in 1897 at the age of 61. Jacob Studebaker was the fifth and final Studebaker brother. He joined the company in 1870 and was the head of salesman for the company. Jacob was in Chicago when he suddenly became ill and died suddenly on December 17, 1887. He was the first Studebaker brother to die. It seems out of place to have a bridge in the middle of a cemetery, especially when there's nothing running under the bridge. But this bridge is referred to as Coquillard's Folly. It was a channel that was supposed to be dug between the outlet of the West Race along the St. Joe River in downtown South Bend, and it was supposed to connect out to the Kankakee River, which is southwest of South Bend. Mr. Coquillard, one of the town founders, started digging. It was about 40 feet wide or so, and it was dug from the St. Joe River between Navarre and Marion Streets to Beck's Lake, which connected into the Kankakee River. It cost Mr. Coquillard $10,000 to build, which was a phenomenal amount of money. The WPA began to fill in the ravine because pretty much it disappeared. Nothing but a trickle of water went through it because of the way the Earth's crust is formed around here. So in 1938, the WPA started to fill in the ravine, and then the Board of Public Works here in South Bend set aside several grave sites in what would be called Coquillard's Folly. They set aside several grave sites for any veteran of any war who had no other place to be buried. On the afternoon of June 30th, 1934, a tan Hudson automobile pulled up in front of the Merchants Bank, which was downtown South Bend between Wayne and Jefferson Street. Several men got out, went into the Merchants Bank, and supposedly they robbed or got about $10,000 to $12,000 out of the bank at the time. The lookout that was outside the door of the Merchants Bank raised a ruckus when some shop owner could figure out what was going on, that the bank was being robbed, and grabbed a gun from under the counter and went out to confront the masked bandit. They started firing up and down Michigan Street, right in the center of the shopping district in South Bend at the time. And this alerted the police officer, Howard Wagner, who was at the corner of Wayne and Main Street. He came running down the block, around the corner, and the masked man turned around and shot him with a Thompson submachine gun. Not long after, the gang came out of the bank, got in the Hudson, and took off down Michigan Street and supposedly went west out past New Carlisle. The Merchants Bank in South Bend had just been robbed by John Dillinger and his gang. Howard Wagner was buried with full honors. Dillinger himself only had less than a month to live after this bank robbery. This was actually his last bank robbery. He was killed by the government's G-men July 22nd, 1934. We had talked about Schuyler Colfax and being vice president. There's also another presidential connection in South Bend City Cemetery, believe it or not. President William McKinley's grandparents are actually buried in South Bend City Cemetery. James McKinley died August 20th, 1847, and his wife Mary died on the same day, just hours apart. It also happened to be their 43rd wedding anniversary. The McKinleys had come to South Bend in 1843, and they lived in Warren Township. When they died, both their caskets containing the remains of Mr. and Mrs. McKinley were lowered into the same grave, one on top of the other. They remained that way for 25 years until their son, William, the father of President William McKinley, had the caskets placed in two separate grave sites. President McKinley often visited the gravesite when he was traveling in the vicinity. His last known visit was in 1894. As you know, President McKinley was assassinated in September of 1901. The 1850 census lists only 5 African-American families living in South Bend. In 1858, Pharaoh and Rebecca Powell and their families bought properties and built homes in South Bend and Mishawaka. Active in the social and business life of early South Bend, the Powells were instrumental in founding the Olivet AME Church in the 1870s, which, believe it or not, the congregation is still in existence. South Bend City Cemetery and its administration did not segregate African American members of the community. That's why they were able to be buried in South Bend City Cemetery along with white folk. The Bryants, another South Bend early American family, African American family, are also buried here in City Cemetery. The Powell and Bryant families still have descendants that are living here in South Bend today. Lathrop Taylor was a fur trader who settled in South Bend in 1827. He was the second European man to permanently settle in South Bend. He, along with Alexis Coquillard, purchased and cleared the land that would later become downtown South Bend. They also donated the land for this original plat of City Cemetery. Taylor established a very successful trading post close to the corner of Washington and Michigan Streets. He was also appointed the first postmaster of South Bend. He lived out the remainder of his life in a home on the southeast side of downtown in what is called Taylor's Field, which is now a local historic district. Samuel C. Sample was the first person elected to represent Indiana's 9th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. He served from 1843 to 1845. After serving in the House, he returned to South Bend, where he went back to practicing law. He died here in South Bend in 1855. You remember his name because Sample Street is named after Representative Samuel C. Sample. John Comely Birdsell was actually born in New York State, was a farmer, and had come up with an invention in the mid-1800s of a machine that could separate the seed from the clover flower, which is very, very, very small. Clover was planted because it was considered what they call a cash crop. You could feed your farm animals with it. They still do today. But it was very hard to try and get seeds to replant the crop the next year. So Mr. Birdsell invented something called a Birdsell clover huller. This is what a Birdsell clover huller looks like. It is a giant machine, runs on a belt to a tractor or stationary engine or a group of horses going around merry-go-round, and you put all of the clover flowers in one end, and it whirls around and chops up and dices and comes out in a bag as clean seed. The waste goes into a pile that you can actually bale into straw or hay, anything that you want to do. But that is a clover huller. Now, Mr. Birdsell brought his business here to South Bend. He had a very, very large factory along Columbia Street where the main post office is now in downtown South Bend. His son took over for the company. His name was Joseph Benjamin Birdsell. He took over control of the company and saw it throughout its rise in fame up until about the Great Depression, when there was other efficient means of getting seed separated from all different plants, not just clover. So that's John Comely Birdsell. Thanks so much for viewing this virtual tour of South Bend City Cemetery. I hope you enjoyed it. You can always find out more about local history by visiting our website, historymuseumsb.org. You can always contact me at the History Museum, 574-235-9664, or you can email me at tchilds@historymuseumsb.org. Thanks again. We want to thank South Bend Parks and Venues, as well as the City of South Bend, for allowing great access